My name's Dom Morley. I'm producer, engineer, mixer, educator at times. I won a Grammy for the Amy Winehouse album Back to Black. I'm currently working on an EP for a singer-songwriter called Lloyd Llewellyn. I recently had a #1 in France with Ibrahim Maalouf album called Sens. The way I started out was I was, I guess like a lot of people, recording my band in my bedroom, and we had a little 4-track cassette machine, or I did, and then I kind of upgraded that to an 8-track reel-to-reel, because this was the mid-90s and that was all we had. Couldn't record audio into computers back then. So I really enjoyed doing that, and I actually enjoyed doing that more than I enjoyed playing in a band. I was playing the bass and it was fine, but gigs didn't particularly excite me, and playing with the sounds really did. So then I went to the library, because this is pre-internet, so I went to the library and I found a book that said what jobs you could do in audio, and there was this sound engineer thing in studio. I was like, yes, that's me, I really want to do that. So there was another book in the library that had a list of all the studios in the UK, their addresses and their equipment. And there was a friend of my dad's worked for TV, he wrote sound for TV. That was the only person I knew that had anything to do with music industry, even though it was TV, but he wrote music for it. And I had a quick chat with him, and he said, you want to get yourself a job in a studio as an assistant or a runner, and if the studio's got a Neve or an SSL, you'll know it's a good studio, right? That can be your that's your barometer. If it's got one of those two, then great. So I just made a list of every studio in London that had a Neve or an SSL, and then I spent 3 days knocking on doors of all these studios saying, I'll work for nothing, I make really good tea. And everybody said no. So then I went to Birmingham, because that was the next biggest city, and I did exactly the same in Birmingham. And somebody said, yeah, all right, come in Monday. So then I went in on Monday, and I just tried to be as helpful as I could. And really it was a bit of luck, because they got a lot of work experience people there, and those people all came from the local college, and they finished at 4 at the local college, so they would just walk out of the studio at 4 o'clock because they'd done their day as far as they were concerned. Now, I was just really excited to be in a studio, so I would turn up at 10 when the doors opened, and I would leave when they turned the alarm off, or when they turned the alarm on, because I just wanted to be there as much as possible. So I was doing 12 or 14-hour days and just trying to be helpful, although my technical knowledge was pretty minimal. Like, I didn't know how to use the SSL at all. But there was a guy there who was producing and engineering, and he just found it useful having someone who he could say, can you move that mic from there to there? And he didn't have to get up and do it. So I ran out and did it, because it was only a little studio and they didn't have an assistant as such. So that was really good. And he recommended me to another studio in Birmingham when they were looking for an assistant. They were looking for an assistant in UB40's studio. And so he said, oh, you should get Dom, because he's been really useful here. So that's how I got my first job, actually working in a studio. And I was there for about 2.5 years, and then I moved down to London, and I worked in a little place called Master Rock, which was great because it had an SSL and it had a Focusrite desk, of which there are very few in the world, and it had one, so that was fun. But then that was only kind of a freelance assistant sort of thing. It wasn't a proper job. And then a job came up at Metropolis Studios, which was the one I really wanted to work in, because it had a Neve, 3 different SSLs, and a Focusrite desk. So all the desks, essentially, all the big professional desks at the time, they had one. And I figured if I worked there, I'd know just how to use desks. I wouldn't know how to use an SSL, I wouldn't know how to use a Neve. I'd know how to use all of them, because I did find the previous studio I'd worked at, we had an SSL, and you'd get people that would come, and if it wasn't an SSL, they couldn't work. They were completely tied to the desk, and I didn't want to be tied to any one bit of gear. I wanted to just be able to turn up somewhere and work. So I got to know how all these desks work. So now you can put me in front of any desk, and I'm like, sound comes in one way and comes out the other, and we make it better in between. So I'm just comfortable getting in and getting stuck in. So that was great, but I was very lucky because there were a lot of studios in those days. There's probably only about 10% now of what there used to be, or maybe 20%. So back then you had a lot better chance of getting a job in a studio and learning from the people that were there, and there were freelancers that would come by that I'd get to become friends with, and I'd ask them for advice. If I knew someone really well, I'd play them a mix that I'd been working on and say, can you name 3 things you'd change? And then I would learn their hearing, I'd learn what they were hearing that was wrong, that I hadn't heard that was wrong. And I think that's actually a big problem these days, in that a lot of people are doing music education, which is great, and they get 2 or 3 years learning at a facility where they've got some great instructors and great tutors and stuff. And then they go out on their own and they don't have all the years of learning off a myriad of freelancers and making friends with them and getting that kind of mentorship and feedback that you get from working in a studio and just being engrossed in the industry and having a big network of people you can draw on. So recently I started up a website called The Mix Consultancy. So it's at themixconsultancy.com, and that enables anybody to upload their mixes, and then I'll give it a good listen on all of my system, and I'll make a load of notes on things that could be better, areas that they possibly haven't heard there are problems, as well as ideas on how to fix it. And then they get all that feedback. And I think at the moment there's a lot of information about how to fix problems of your mix. You know, if you know you've got a problem with bass or muddiness or harshness or things like that, then you can search that on YouTube and you'll find somebody that will explain a few techniques of getting rid of it. But I think the problem is people don't know where their problems are. They might just hear their mix and know it doesn't sound as good as the one on the radio, but they don't know why. And if you don't know why, then you don't know what to search for to find the answers. So what I do with the mix consultancy is I actually listen to the mixes and then I'll give them the reasons why it doesn't sound as good as it could be, as well as the solution. So I think it's kind of unique in that respect that you can upload it to, you know, a Grammy-winning engineer who's been doing it for 20 years, and you'll get my brain dump on how what I would do if I were given this mix right now. This is how I would make it better. Yeah, it was interesting because when I started in professional studios, it was 24-track tape machines, you know, and there was a computer there, but it would be an Atari or something, and it was sequencing things, running the sampler. There was no digital audio in the room, you know, that wasn't it for control rooms. You might have an editing suite upstairs where you'd have a stereo editing thing that you could chop mixes up with, but computers weren't fast enough to run audio. So I was there for that whole transition, and I do remember the first session that I recorded entirely on Pro Tools of being very nervous about it, that we weren't running tape, because they weren't massively reliable, those early Pro Tools systems, and they could crash, and also, you know, my experience with it was limited. I hadn't done loads. I'd used it for editing. You know, you'd run Pro Tools along with the tape machine. You might throw something into Pro Tools, edit it, put it back on tape. But tape was your reliable source of once it was on tape, it was done. And I was just a bit nervous about it being in a computer and then disappearing and not knowing where it went. So it was a while getting into using the digital audio via computers, because we did have digital tape machines, but that still gave you that same level of confidence that it's on tape, therefore it's done. So it was a while for me to get the confidence that if it was in a computer, we weren't going to lose it. You know, you obviously have to care about backups a bit more, but it was gonna be something that we could rely on and it would stay there. And then you finally got into the love of it for the flexibility, and then I didn't really want to go back. So much as tape sounds good, and I did do a session on tape about 3 years after not doing tape at all. I was just in Pro Tools, recording and mixing from Pro Tools, and then I did a session where they wanted to do it on tape, and it was in Air Studios on their big Neve. It was in Studio One, so not the big church room, but Studio One, old Neve, tape machines. And it was just, this is easy. All I can do is mess it up from here, really. Just put the mics in the right place, get it through an old Neve, put it onto tape, sounds amazing. So that was really nice, and you remember that tape does sound great, but digital audio is progressing at such a rate that the difference in sound is so minimal and is getting less that the advantage you get with the flexibility of putting in a computer is vastly outweighs the small difference in sound. That's a tough question, really. I'm always asked in interviews what's the hardest or who's the most difficult person to work with, and here's why I struggle to answer. It's one of the first people I ever worked with was a producer called Jerry Parchment. When my first job was from a studio that was owned by UB40, and he worked with them a lot. He was a really good guy, and he did a lot of other freelance stuff as well as doing them and their tours. And he said, whenever you're on a session, this was only about my third session ever, whenever you're on a session, there's always something that you can find that you'll enjoy. Because I was about to embark on an album with a band called Cradle of Filth, who were in that black metal world absolutely brilliant, but that wasn't my thing at all. And being quite new to it, I was like, am I not going to enjoy the next 6 weeks? And he said, yeah, you will. All you do is you find the thing that you love, and there'll be something in there. There'll be the way the drums are played, there'll be the guitar parts, or just the people that you're with, there'll be something that you really enjoy about the session. And I've carried that bit of advice with me for 20 years, and I always, no matter what's going on, I'll always be concentrating on the thing that I really enjoy in the session. And actually with the Cradle of Filth one, the drums were incredible, the guitars were amazing, the people were really nice, I had a really good time. But that bit of advice, I think really works in any job, you know, whatever you're doing, just find the thing that there's always something in it you'll really enjoy, concentrate on that thing, and you come out of it with a positive experience. So I always struggle to think of something that went wrong because I've remembered the good bits about it, you know what I mean? So as an engineer, I've worked with things like Amy and Sting and Adele and things that are quite, I tend to get things that are quite organic and or that want to be organic and warm sounding and natural. That's the sort of stuff that comes to me, which is great. I think that's what I'm good at. Things that you get put on as an assistant, you know, because you work for a studio and they're the people that have come through the studio, and not necessarily what work for you musically or technically or where you would be. But as an assistant, it's not really your role to get those sounds. It's the engineer's job. So it doesn't really matter if I don't know how to get a heavy metal drum sound or a black metal drum sound, because I'm the assistant. The engineer will tell me what mics to pick and where to put them, and I'll do all that, and then he'll get the black metal drum sound. So as an assistant, it doesn't matter so much about the type of music that you're on and the albums that you've made, because you're not called upon to be part of the choosing the microphones and the EQs to get the sound. You're just part of the support team for that. Yeah, so those were in Metropolis. Basically, there was a period where about 3 years I was Mark Ronson's engineer in London. So I think at the time he had a guy he tended to use in New York, a guy in LA, and me in London. So over that period we did his album version, which had the track Valerie on, which was quite a big hit. And we did Amy Winehouse's Back to Black album, the tracks that he did off that one. And we also did a track called Cold Shoulder, which was on Adele's first album. And then a bunch of other things that we were working on at the time. So that's what all of that was done at Metropolis, or I think the Adele one we did at Olympic, which doesn't exist anymore. It's now Cinema, I think. But yeah, mostly done at Metropolis, which is where I had been an employee. I trained at Metropolis in Chiswick, so I was in-house engineer there for a while, and then I left, but carried on working there quite a bit. Amy Winehouse's album was actually mixed by a guy called Tom Elmhurst, and he worked out of Studio C of Metropolis for a few years. He's in New York now, but yeah, that was mixed there. And I think he mixed 2 Adele albums there as well, and I think he mixed the last one in New York because it was after he'd moved out. As I said, I'm in the middle of nowhere, and that's great up until a point where you realise you'd never spoken to anyone, and you get a bit isolated, because I do a lot of mixing work and editing and all those sort of things, so nobody comes for that. Like, as an example, the trumpet player that I've mixed 4 albums for and never met. Nobody needs to come for mixing. We can communicate well. I'm used to working remotely for clients, so that's great. But yeah, there's a point where you need more human contact, you know, and it can be fine that you go home to a family and you see your friends at the weekend, and that's all great, but you're at work a lot. It's a big chunk of your life, and if you're spending all of that in a room on your own, it can be quite isolating and quite depressing. So after a little while of being in here, I think it's about 1.5 years, I started to feel a bit weird about coming in. And I couldn't work out why I was feeling so uncomfortable about coming into the studio, because I've been working for 20 years to get my own room full of too many modular synths and loads of compressors and stuff that I really like. But then I was sitting at the door and not coming in, and it was, you know, music that I wanted to work on, all of this stuff. It didn't make sense. And then I suddenly realised it was the fact that I was in this room on my own, and I would be for the next 20 years or whatever, and that was uncomfortable. So I'd been thinking about getting into education for a little while. It's just something that I think needs to be done by people once you've been doing something for a little while. Just try and spread a bit of experience, because as I was saying earlier, I was lucky enough to work in a studio where loads of freelancers came by. I would ask them questions and I would learn a lot. And I know I'm not spreading any knowledge by sitting in a room on my own without any assistance and without any help. You know, I'm not teaching anybody. So in order to kind of pass on what was passed on to me, I started to look into doing education. So now I do guest lecturing in universities, so I go around the country doing that. I give talks at the NAMM show every year over in LA, and I am the tutor for the master's course at Leeds College of Music for music production. So that's kind of a regular scheduled thing that I will go and I will just talk to people all day. So it's good for me in terms of getting out and speaking to people. It's good for the mental health in that respect, and also I think it's good for everybody to spread a little bit of knowledge and experience to people that are 20 years behind you on the road, you know. Maybe. Kind of depends what I've got going on. You know, if I'm free, then, you know, I'll go. But you can always find me on dommorley.com, so that's easy, and themixconsultancy.com as well. So, you know, find me on either one.